episode of RPMbassy. Today's just going to be a little quick one. Again, I want to talk about a band that is pretty underrated in my opinion, and a band that I think has been kind of secretly influential over the years in terms of the sort of metal subgenres that there are out there, particularly like the heavier stuff and the kind of new wave of metalcore that we've had over the past few years, that kind of more sort of musically thoughtful version of it. And the band that I want to talk about today is the band Will Haven with their album Voir. So this is a 2011 album, and it's by no means their most popular. In fact, I'd say it's probably their least popular from what I've seen about feedback of it online and the overall sort of amount of response that there was for the album. But I think this album is quite important, and I think the band themselves are very important in terms of the music they made, the bands that they were sort of contemporaries with at the time, and how other bands have kind of changed their style in a way that feels like Will Haven may have had at least a small hand in it, if only due in part to the fact that they are quite close with bands like Deftones and stuff like that, and the way that Deftones have been such a huge influence on the sort of wider metal scene over the past few years, when they've kind of had this bit of a resurgence and you've seen all of these younger bands who grew up listening to Deftones come along. But I think Will Haven have quite a big place in that as well, and I want to talk about this album and kind of just go over a little bit more about why it's deserving of a little bit more. So we'll kind of just jump into the album as a whole, how it sounds. This is a very sludgy album, and they are kind of like a sludgy metal band in the first place. If you've listened to their previous stuff, especially Will Haven, like the second album they did, or WHVN, that's a very kind of low-tuned and muddy, dirty sounding album. This, though, I think is more so. There's a very obvious intent behind how they've recorded, how they've produced this album, and one of the really important things I think with this album is how the guitars sound. The guitars on this are almost tuned too low, not in terms of it like being the overall note, but when you take a regular, if you have a guitar that's tuned to E standard and you tune the lower strings down to, let's say, an A, as you would have sort of a step down from standard 7-string tuning, then obviously the strings become very, very loose, very, very floppy. They can't hold tension properly, and the note very, very much like warbles in and out of actually being in tune. And this album has that, and I think it's a very intentional choice to kind of really push home that sort of almost DIY, garagey kind of sludge sound, where it's almost like an intentional lack of preparation. Like, they didn't go out and buy new strings that would hold tension correctly. They played with strings that wouldn't hold tension properly because it sounds more raw and more sort of authentic to how that kind of scene was always would always sound like. They also have their kind of like classic sound that they've always had mixed in, which is the sort of sludginess but mixed with a load of ambient passages. And this is why I think that they're actually quite an important band, because they did these sorts of things a lot sooner than many, many, many bands that have kind of been lauded for it in the past few years. You listen to this and you listen to some of their other work, and for me it's incredibly apparent that bands like Norma Jean and Loathe have kind of taken what Will Haven did and kind of like hit the ground running with it to develop it in their own way. Norma Jean, especially on their, I think it's a 2016 album, Polar Similar, that sounds almost identical in terms of the sort of the way the album is arranged. They've got these kind of weird ambient passages they're ambient in the sense that they aren't heavy. They're not ambient in the sense that they're relaxing. They're very, very good for building tension. They're very kind of off-putting and creepy, and this kind of really pushes that home. So as far as the kind of recording of this album goes, two sort of, not two new members, but a returning member and a new member are the sort of important people to mention. So as far as vocals go, Grady Avenell is back on vocals on this album. He previously had sort of missed the last album. He'd written on it, but he hadn't sung on it, and that the sort of vocal duties were left to Jeff Javosky, and so he's back on this one. As far as like that last album, actually, it sounded very Will Haven, but it was definitely a lot kind of cleaner sounding than anything else they'd done. It was a lot closer to alternative metal than it was to sludge. Vocally, it sounded very similar. I think Jeff and Grady have very, very similar vocal styles, and it lends itself really well to this. It's that kind of raw, hardcore screaming kind of style, which doesn't have any real tonality to it. It's just pure like aggression. And whether or not there's any technique behind it, I don't know. It kind of sounds like they're just kind of shredding their vocal cords, but it really does work. But yeah, Grady's back on this one. You've also then got Chris Fenn, who you may recognise the name of as the percussionist from Slipknot, or should I say former percussionist from Slipknot. So he was playing bass on this rather than any sort of drum work. And again, like the kind of bass tones and stuff really lend themselves to that sludgy nature. The bass tone is almost like inaudible in a sense, not in the way that like Sex Pistols would have had on stage, but they've kind of really driven home this kind of sloppy, sludgy, just distorted, run it through like a load of distortion pedals, and it's all just like fully like low end and no real like upper end clarity, and it kind of just it's almost like a sub bass rather than an actual regular bass tone, and it fills out the sound in a huge way. The first song, actually, we'll just get into the tracks because of the way that the sort of production really lends itself to the music. The first song, Held to Answer, starts off with like this weird ambient passage. It's a very sort of haunting, ethereal, kind of choral kind of thing. You've got kind of almost like angel choirs singing, and then it just smashes you in the face about 1 minute in, and it's just this huge hit. It's guitar, it's bass, it's drums, and then it goes away straight away again, and it's just the bass doing this low, rumbly kind of line with really ambient guitar leads on it. Lots of like reverb and chorus, and loads of like sort of shimmery kind of reverb on the lead lines. It sounds fantastic, and then that's pretty much it for the entire song. And you've got this like long ambient part with Grady just screaming over the top of it, and like for me that's such an interesting way to approach, first of all, the opener of the album, but also a song in general. You know, most of the time you wouldn't expect that kind of vocal performance to lend itself to such a clean guitar and clean sort of composition overall, but it works really well, and it feels very emotional. It's got that kind of raw emotion that you would get from Converge or something like that, and there is definitely like a metalcore feel, like early metalcore feel that's in this album along with the sludge. The rest of the tracks kind of like follow a very similar sort of vibe in many ways, that a lot of them have that kind of ambient intro, or they've got kind of palette cleansers and interludes and stuff. A couple of other important ones, When the Walls Close In, that's track 2. That and Held to Answer were both singles from this album, and they both got kind of like, it almost feels like amateur shot videos. They're not 100% perfect, they're not cinematically amazing, but they again have that kind of raw vibe to them, so I recommend checking those out. Urban Agoge, that's like again got this sort of weird palette cleanser to it. The Siege, track 4, that's one that I really love. It's very close to, if you've listened to WHVN, the second album, it's very close to the song Slopez. It's essentially one guitar line that's almost the same. I think I probably prefer Slopez overall, because that's kind of almost a little bit more intentionally dark and menacing, but this has the same sort of feel to it. So the Siege is one to really check out. Midas Secret as well, that's an amazing sound, and probably the closest, that and Lives Left to Wither, track 7 and 8, they're probably the closest to the sort of production and the tonality that was on the Aerophant, in terms of like the guitar sound and the arrangement, the way they've kind of left space in the mix for things. So they're probably would I say they're the most accessible? Maybe not. I wouldn't say the album's massively accessible in any way, but they're kind of like the closest to the slightly older sound that they would have had. One of the standout tracks for me is track 10, Lost. So it's pretty much ambient all the way through. You've got the kind of like similar sort of thing as track 1 with Grady screaming over ambient passages. There are some guitar bits. Again, you've got that sort of sludgy bass, but this is a really kind of reserved track overall. Very reverbed out guitar lines and stuff. It's just kind of creating a space. But the really amazing part for me is when the end of Lost just kind of slowly fades off into that sort of reverbed out sound, which then leads straight back in to the start of Held to Answer. So the album kind of has this eternal loop to it where it's like a perfect like 360, and yeah, that it's a small detail, but I love when albums do that, and it's really, really fantastic to hear it on this. It's kind of, you kind of get blasted and killed by the album, and then you just do it all over again. As far as the actual physical release, it's a fairly simple one. The actual sort of liner is pretty plain and simple. You've got the album cover there. I should note, actually, it's going to be probably quite hard to see it. I'll see if it goes up on camera. But just there, that is Chris Fenn's Slipknot mask. I don't know if you'll be able to see it on camera very well. See if I can get it to focus. Just there. I thought that was quite a cool little addition, just to have a sort of little like reminder, like, oh hey, this guy's in our band. And then the insert, we've got a lyric selection there, just to cover all of the track lyrics and stuff, and a few sort of like personnel messages on the bottom as well. This one in particular is a yellow sparkle vinyl, which is very, very pretty. As far as like the aesthetic goes, I wouldn't say it like fits with the album per se, but it's nice nonetheless. And yeah, just a really like nice little pickup to have, in my opinion. As far as listening to this album goes and like checking it out for yourself, it is quite hard to find. Probably YouTube's going to be your best bet if you don't want to make a purchase. It's not on streaming as far as I'm aware, certainly not on Apple Music, and that's kind of a shame, to be honest. I do have like a copy digitally because it comes with an MP3 code in with the record, but I don't know whether or not it's some sort of like distribution argument or something like that. But then the previous album was distributed by the same guys, Beela Bros, and that's on streaming everywhere. That's very easily accessible. So if you do want to check the album out, I think you're probably just going to have to rely on YouTube and just, you know, the playlists that people have made of the album. Obviously the music videos are up on there because that's where they kind of were released. I really do recommend checking it out, and if you haven't listened to them in any big way, or if you're entirely unfamiliar with them, like, it's really worth giving this one a shot. I would also suggest checking out all the rest of the stuff. The rest of the stuff is way more easily accessible, by the way. I would say probably WHVN, Carpe Diem, Aerophant, those are the ones to check out alongside this, and then you can kind of expand to the sort of debut album and the albums that have come since. There's 3 albums after this one, including the last one, which was just last year in July. So definitely do check them out and kind of see if you can listen to where maybe they've had influence on the kind of genre as a whole, and where you can, especially like Carpe Diem 2001 album, you can definitely pick up where they've clearly worked with Deftones, they clearly know that sound, they've clearly got that kind of like that sort of sound of the area where they grew up, that kind of local scene sound. So yeah, definitely give them a look. If you can find this album physically, give it a shot. It's not that popular, as I said, so you may find that it's pretty inexpensive. And if you can't find it that way, give it a listen on YouTube. Give the other albums a listen. They're all fantastic. They all have their own qualities to them. And yeah, I just hope that this is a little bit more popular in the future. I hope that this band sees more widespread acclaim, because they really are deserving of it. I think they're an incredibly important band in metal, and I don't think they've been given the shape that they deserve, really. So yeah, please check it out. They are a fantastic band who have made, as far as I'm concerned, nothing but bangers the entire way through their career, and this is, you know, absolutely one of them. it deserves more. So please give it a look. But yeah, other than that, that's it for this week. Hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully you've learned something about a band that you may not have heard before. And yeah, we'll see you next time. Cheers.